Cities with monumental architecture were established in valleys along the Pacific coast of western South America between 3000 and 1500 BC. Now, this is a somewhat unusual area, perhaps, for large-scale cities to emerge because it is an extremely arid desert, the driest desert in the world. In some places in coastal Peru and northern Chile, there has been no rainfall ever recorded since the Spanish first arrived 500 years ago. There is dew that comes off of the ocean, moist clouds and fog, but no precipitation. However, rain falls in the headwaters of the rivers that flow through these valleys up in the Andes Mountains, and the rain then flows through the rivers, allowing for the development of irrigation systems. And similar to the arid desert here in the Phoenix Basin, irrigation transformed these arid valleys into lush oases of agriculture. Cotton and gourds were the first crops that were cultivated. Cotton used to weave nets and gourds used to make floats, and these nets and floats would be used to catch fish in the ocean. Later, plants that were domesticated in other areas of South America were introduced and adopted, including beans, squash, sweet potatoes, and peanuts. The availability of irrigable agricultural land was limited. Beyond the floodplain of the river that could be cultivated, the dry desert is practically a moonscape with almost no plants growing. So irrigable land was a circumscribed resource. It had limits and boundaries. However, there was a very productive marine environment, providing fish, shellfish, crustaceans. El Niño events, periodic warming of the ocean, could cause severe disturbances, leading to crashes in local marine populations and limiting the ability to collect resources from these areas. So these contexts created certain management needs that needed to be fulfilled. Management of irrigation systems, their construction, their maintenance, their operation, allocating water among the users, managing conflict, adjudicating competing claims for land and water, as well as managing the surpluses and shortfalls of marine productivity. We often think that management of surpluses was a very important factor in the emergence of complex societies, but in some cases, managing those periods of shortfalls were perhaps more important than managing those periods of excess production. And there is evidence that warfare played an important role in the consolidation of power in these early states. In this overview of the early ceremonial center of Corral, you can see the nature of this extremely arid desert. It looks like the moon or Mars. To the left of the photo, we can see outside the frame is the Corral River, which allowed irrigation and still has lush and irrigated fields. But once you move away from the river, there is almost no resources other than minerals that can be extracted from the environment. So agriculture is a circumscribed and limited resource that people would have competed over, especially as populations began to grow. Corral and other early sites sort of laid the template for what later ceremonial centers would look like, with a standardized arrangement of raised platforms around an open sunken court. Here we can see the circular sunken court with a platform to the left and a larger, higher platform, almost pyramidal in its final configuration, to the right. And these sorts of ceremonial features that allowed the gathering of large crowds in order to participate in public rituals that affirmed the power of the state and the power of the ruler are fairly standard and found throughout the next 3,000 years of human occupation of the region. In the reading by Sheila and Thomas Pozorski, they describe one of the sites that they have been working at in the Cosma River Valley in central Peru. Pampa de las Llamas La Mocheque is a large administrative center that emerged in this area beginning about 3000 BC. As irrigation systems along these river valleys were consolidated, put together into larger and more efficient irrigation systems, several large administrative centers that seemed to have been integrated together emerged. While only two of these large administrative centers are shown on the map, the Pampa de las Llamas, and the perhaps capital of this region, the Sechen Alto complex, there are others, and they're sort of evenly spaced along these irrigation systems in order to provide administrative control and direction. You can also see in the map the limited and circumscribed nature of the availability of arable land. The land that is shown in green is those areas that could be irrigated and cultivated, while those areas beyond are the dry desert. Pampa de las Llamas was a large urban site with different zones within it. In the map, you can see how large it is, and this is only the center of the city, the area that has been intensively explored. Some of the site has been impacted by modern farming, but it is an incredibly large site. The area shown within this map is 2 kilometers from north to south, and nearly 1 kilometer across, and is only the very center of the site. So we have different urban zones, a civic ceremonial center that is shown in this map, where you have huacas, the Huaca A that we will look at in greater detail momentarily, and the Mocheque, a large pyramid at the northern end of a series of large plazas at the center of the site. These plazas that hold this monumental architecture are ringed by administrative buildings and elite residences. And then in the next zone beyond would have been craft workshops, where various specialists were plying their trade, potters, weavers, metal workers. And then beyond that were lower status residences of more common workers. And even beyond that, out in the irrigated fields were smaller communities of farmers, and along the coast, small communities of fishers, all integrated through economic activities that would occur in these large plazas, markets that allowed people to exchange their wares, whether they be agricultural goods, craft goods, or marine resources. So we see evidence of social and economic differentiation. And this and other large centers emerged as irrigation systems, small irrigation systems, were consolidated and integrated into larger irrigation systems that could more effectively and efficiently distribute water and more equally allocate it among various users. In this artist's reconstruction of the civic ceremonial center of Pampa de las Llamas, you see a sunken court in the foreground with Huaca A in the center. To the right and the left, on the peripheries of the large open plaza, are administrative buildings and the residences of the ruling political and economic elite. And in the far background, we see the Mocheque pyramid. These sorts of sunken court, raised platforms, and pyramidal features are a persistent feature in Andean communal architecture, and we will see them again when we talk about the Inca. Huaca is a Quechua word, Quechua being the language that was spoken by the later Inca Empire, and is a word for a sacred place or thing. It could be either natural, like a mountain, a spring, or it could be something that was man-made, a platform or a pyramid. Huaca A is at the center of the plaza at Pampa de las Llamas, and was a central complex of storerooms built on top of a raised platform. It could hold 4,400 cubic meters of stores. There's evidence that it was used to store agricultural products as well as luxury goods like fine textiles and metalwork. Access to it was restricted. In the map you can see there are entryways at the top and the bottom on the sort of north and southern sides, but once you enter in, there are limits, and many of the rooms can only be accessed by going through a series of other smaller rooms. So there are limits to access and limits in the movement once you are within. This photo shows the entrance on the south side of the Huaca, and you can see portions of a relief sculpture that were along the walls, flanking either side of the doorway. While only a limited amount of this relief sculpture remained, the remainder having eroded away over the millennia, we can predict what it was intended to depict because of other art that is preserved in other forms elsewhere. It depicts the tail and the feet of what were likely large pumas or jaguars. And these large felines become a symbol of political power in Andean communal art. And we see the association of rulers with these large, powerful predators. But these are not just ordinary pumas or jaguars. As you can note in the lower left, the tail of the jaguar is a serpent that grows from its body. These are not natural jaguars or ordinary jaguars. They are extraordinary and supernatural. And in this depiction, these large jaguars flank the entrance to the Huaca. You would have to pass between them. It is as though they are guardians of the doorway, protecting the stores within, representatives of the ruling elite and the power of the king. Timber was an incredibly rare resource in these desert environments, and in some cases many of the buildings were not roofed at all, because it almost never rained. There was no need for roofing. But there was use of timbers in many areas of the Huaca, and they were used to create gates in order to limit and restrict access, to control the resources that were stored within. The investment of this rare and difficult to obtain resource in these features also underscores their importance. And here we can see many logs that were part of a complex door or gateway within the Huaca. And here is a schematic of how those logs would have been arranged to create this gate that could be opened and closed to limit access and protect the stores within. So we can see from features like Huaca A that the control and management of stored resources was a central factor in the creation and maintenance of state power. But what were some other factors? These are large and complex sites that are just beginning to yield the information that we need. But some of the information comes from religious structures. So at the site of Cerro Sechén, which we believe may have been the capital in this valley, it is the largest site within the valley and centrally located in order to administer other centers within the region. And at Cerro Sechén, there is a temple structure. Actually, two separate structures. We see the Templo de Barro within, the Temple of Earth, that has relief sculptures in clay along its walls and within its rooms. This is enclosed by the Templo de Piedra, the Temple of Rock, which is created by large upright monoliths that have been engraved. We have different types of iconography that are used in these different temples, different representations encapsulating different concepts and ideas. Within the Temple of Earth, the relief sculptures depict the bounty of agricultural production and the marine life. There are pictures of fish and of plants, and it is all that is good in the world, all that is needed to support and sustain life, depicted in this soft medium. The temple, with the depictions of the agricultural bounty that is needed to sustain life, is enclosed within the temple of rock, and the images that are carved onto the monoliths that create these are very different. Rather than depicting the pleasantries of life, the agricultural bounty and the bounty of the sea life that sustains people, it shows what protects this bounty, what preserves it and allows it to be used by the people. There are depictions of military might. While I don't have any good images of the clay relief sculptures depicting the marine life and agricultural bounty, in the next few slides we will look at some of the depictions of the military power of the state, what was needed in order to control and protect these resources for the benefit of the community, what was used to establish and maintain the power of the rulers. Central to these depictions are soldiers wearing distinctive uniforms that identify them as agents of the state. And these soldiers are shown with stacks of decapitated heads, dismembered bodies, rows of eyeballs that have been plucked out of those who perhaps had dared to resist the state, those who had challenged the power and authority of the state, those who had questioned the directives of the state. These standardized depictions of the warriors wearing particular uniforms that identify them suggest the emergence of a professional, full-time military class that is used by the ruling elite in order to express their power and maintain their control, to limit dissent and protect the resources needed to support these populations from others who may try to control them. Remember, these are limited resources, and there was likely competition as they were consolidated under the control of a single center, and military might was essential to creating this consolidation and maintaining the power of those who consolidated the irrigation systems and controlled the agricultural production along them. And the temple is a artistic description of this relationship, of the need for military might and power to protect that fragile bounty that is needed to support life. Military might is expressed in the medium of stone, hard and unyielding, while the agricultural and marine bounty that is needed to sustain life is soft and fragile, much like life itself. And the stone walls depict the power of the state and their ability to protect and preserve these resources for the benefit of the people. And it shows what happens to those who resist the state powers. They are summarily dispatched by the professional warriors. Their heads are removed and placed in piles. Their spines are removed. On the left side of the image, you see that sort of geometric pattern that has been interpreted as representing the spine of a human being after their execution and dismemberment. While managing and controlling surplus and being able to use these surpluses to feed populations during periods of shortfalls, during the El Niño periods when marine environments had lost their productivity, was a central part of the emergence of power. What was perhaps even more important was the ability to use military might to protect these resources, to expand your control over irrigation systems and the agricultural bounty that they produced, to consolidate power and maintain this power. So we see that military might, that conflict was very important in the emergence of these states. So things to remember about coastal Peru is that monumental architecture and early urbanism actually preceded ceramics. People had irrigation agriculture and grew cotton and gourds that were used for fishing nets. Ceramics were introduced with other crops that had been domesticated in adjacent areas and were introduced later. Crops like beans, peanuts, sweet potatoes, and squash. Land along rivers that could be irrigated was a circumscribed resource. It's limited in its distribution, and there is a potential for conflict over these resources that were essential to support human life. Conflict over control of land and the water from the rivers that was used to irrigate it. The marine environment was highly productive, but it could have periodic crashes related to El Nino phenomenon. So managing these surpluses as well as these periods of shortfall provided an avenue to power. So we have different pathways to power through the management of the irrigation systems, managing their construction and maintenance and operation, allocating water among the users, the management of surpluses from this production and shortfalls relating to the crashes of marine environments. And warfare seems to have played a very important role in consolidating and maintaining power, as we see expressed in the artwork of Cerro Sachin.